Imagine waking up precisely when your wonderfully rested body decides it is actually ready to face the world. There is absolutely no screeching alarm, no soul-crushing. The typical modern human spends an astonishingly depressing 90,000 hours of their precious lives working. That is roughly 1/3 of your entire waking existence entirely dedicated to the grind of a job. Yet, for the overwhelmingly massive majority of human history, jobs simply did not exist. There was no soul-sucking employment, no measly hourly wages, no passive-aggressive boss, and absolutely no imaginary career ladder to frantically climb. So what on earth did our ancestors actually do all day? Let us begin with what we know for absolute scientific certainty. Way back in 1963, a pioneering archaeologist named Richard Lee conducted a groundbreaking study that would permanently shatter how we understand prehistoric life. He meticulously tracked the daily, casual activities of the Doju Hungsi people in Botswana, one of the precious few remaining groups still living in a delightfully natural way that closely resembles pre-agricultural human life. To his surprise, he found that fully grown adults spent a mere 2.5 days per week acquiring food. That is roughly a measly 17 hours of work. The rest of their abundant time was spent doing absolutely whatever their hearts desired. And here is the incredibly important part. This surprisingly relaxed pattern stubbornly shows up everywhere anthropologists bother to look. Whether observing the Hadza in Tanzania, the ACH in Paraguay, or the Martu in Australia, completely different, harsh environments on entirely different continents yielded the exact same leisurely result. They spent a meager 15 to 20 hours per week on bare survival activities. Just for a little painful context, you probably work at least twice that much just to pay for rent. Now, some of you skeptical folks are inevitably thinking, but those are modern people. How on earth do we know ancient humans lived the exact same cozy way? That is a remarkably fair question, and the fascinating answer is actually written in their bones. When clever archaeologists compare the fossilized skeletons of ancient humans directly to those of early agricultural populations, the stark difference is nothing short of dramatic. The poor early farmers were significantly shorter. Their weary bones show glaring, painful signs of severe nutritional deficiency. Their sad teeth were thoroughly riddled with painful cavities from their dull, grain-heavy diets. They suffered from agonizing arthritis in their spines from endless, repetitive labor, and they tragically died much younger. Meanwhile, ancient hunter-gatherer skeletons were noticeably taller, robustly stronger, with sparklingly healthier teeth and significantly less joint damage. Their robust bones tell a crystal-clear story. They were doing far less repetitive, back-breaking physical labor, not more. But the absolute most fascinating, mind-blowing evidence comes from something archaeologists discovered that logically shouldn't even exist if daily survival was a brutal, constant struggle: art. In 1994, intrepid explorers discovered the breathtaking Chauvet Cave in scenic southern France. Tucked safely inside were magnificent paintings created roughly 30,000 years ago. Majestic horses, fierce lions, and powerful rhinoceroses were beautifully rendered with artistic perspective, delicate shading, and realistic movement. These were certainly not crude, childish stick figures. This was highly sophisticated, breathtaking art that required immense skill, careful planning, and, most importantly of all, abundant free time. Someone happily spent hours, perhaps even days, deep inside a dark cave by flickering firelight, passionately painting animals on a rocky wall. They did this not for survival and certainly not for food, but purely for beauty, for profound meaning, or simply as a fun way to pass the time. Over in the mysterious Blambos cave in South Africa, intrigued archaeologists unearthed incredibly ancient, 100,000-year-old perforated shell beads. Tiny, delicate holes meticulously drilled through delicate seashells, clearly meant to be fashionably strung together as jewelry. Mind you, the nearest sandy coastline was a whopping 20 kilometers away. Some dedicated prehistoric fashionista walked a grueling 40-kilometer round trip just to collect pretty shells, and then happily spent hours carefully drilling tiny holes with primitive stone tools, all just to look absolutely fabulous. In 2008, curious researchers found a remarkably preserved 40,000-year-old flute carved from a vulture bone in Germany. It featured 5 delicate finger holes, absolutely perfectly spaced. Whoever crafted this masterpiece deeply understood music. They intuitively understood pitch. And they willingly spent a highly significant amount of time meticulously crafting it. This wasn't built for hunting, nor was it meant for defense. It was created purely for the joy of music. And these are by no means isolated, lucky finds. Across Europe, Africa, and Asia, ancient archaeological sites dating from 100,000 years ago onward are literally overflowing with rich evidence of highly decorative objects. There are carefully crafted tools that are far more elaborate and beautiful than strictly necessary for basic survival, alongside whimsical items that required hours of intensely focused, dedicated work with absolutely no immediate practical benefit. This is precisely what happy prehistoric people did when they weren't actively securing food. They eagerly created, they beautifully decorated, they masterfully made things beautiful. So, let us delightfully reconstruct a typical, gloriously unproductive day in this prehistoric paradise. You wake up squinting around dawn, greeted not by a screeching smartphone alarm, but by the gentle, earthy aroma of last night's campfire, which is still lazily smoldering in the cool morning air. Someone obligingly tosses a few dry branches onto the embers to coax them back to life. For breakfast, there is no artisanal avocado toast or fancy latte. Instead, you happily munch on some leftover roasted meat or grilled fish from yesterday, perhaps accompanied by a handful of slightly bruised wild nuts or sweet berries collected the previous afternoon. Breakfast is a leisurely, highly social affair. People mumble, gossip, and casually chat. They plan their day with an incredibly loose, beautifully vague agenda. Not because a corporate calendar demands it, but simply because that is what chatty humans naturally do. Around mid-morning, a small, leisurely group might finally decide to wander off to hunt or gather. But here is the magnificent, life-affirming key. You absolutely do not go out every single day. If the hunt from 2 days ago was highly successful and the communal larder is comfortably stocked, you might comfortably choose not to leave the cozy camp at all. Instead, you might spend a remarkably peaceful morning meticulously working on your favorite tools, lovingly sharpening a flint spear, intricately weaving a sturdy basket, or patiently scraping an animal hide to make it delightfully soft and usable. This is not work in our modern, soul-crushing sense. There is no ticking clock, no demanding supervisor breathing down your neck, and absolutely no quarterly targets to hit. You do it simply because personal competence matters, because being remarkably skilled earns you genuine respect, and because crafting beautiful things well is an essential, deeply satisfying part of being human. If a hunt does happen to occur, it is certainly not the frantic, action-packed chase filled with dramatic slow-motion leaps that you see in Hollywood movies. Humans, as it turns out, are relentlessly patient persistence hunters. We do not sprint wildly. Instead, we doggedly track animals at a steady, rhythmic jog for hours on end, under the blistering sun, until the poor beasts literally overheat, exhaust themselves, and collapse. We are the only bizarre species on Earth that can do this highly effectively, purely because we can sweat profusely and regulate our body temperature while running. Most furry animals simply cannot do this, so we inevitably outlast them. This sweaty endeavor might take a modest 3 to 6 hours, including the commute back. Then, the animal is triumphantly carried back to camp and skillfully butchered. Everyone feasts, and by the early afternoon, the supposedly productive part of the day is essentially wonderfully over. What happens next is precisely what overworked modern people, trapped in their cubicles, find hardest to comprehend. Absolutely nothing, and yet absolutely everything. People blissfully rest. They sit comfortably in the cool shade and chat about nothing in particular. They play endlessly with giggling children. They affectionately groom each other, meticulously picking through hair for bugs and debris, which beautifully reinforces social bonds. They patiently fashion elegant jewelry from delicate shells, colorful beads, or sharp animal teeth. They lazily carve intricate designs into weathered bones or soft stones. They take glorious naps. The brilliant anthropologist James Sussman famously documented that among the Juansi, adults spent roughly 6 hours per day in what he termed purely social time. This was not working, and it was not sleeping. It was simply being around other people, talking, laughing, and telling terribly silly jokes. Because in a primitive world entirely devoid of money, police officers, or legally binding written contracts, your literal survival depended entirely on the quality of your relationships. If people did not particularly like you, they had absolutely no obligation to share their hard-earned food when you were starving. So, you wisely invested enormous amounts of time in those social bonds. Not because it was economically productive, but because it was precisely how humans stayed human. Then, the warm sun sets, and this is when something truly remarkable happens. In 2014, the insightful anthropologist Polly Wiesner analyzed hundreds of hours of fascinating conversation recordings from the Zhuangzi. During the bright daylight, conversations were strictly practical and mundane. Who saw fresh animal tracks where? Which wild plants were finally ready for harvest? There were also plenty of petty complaints about someone not sharing their food fairly. But at night, gathered around the flickering, hypnotic fire, a staggering 81% of conversations dramatically shifted to captivating stories. These were grand myths about how the cosmos began, heroic tales of ancient ancestors who did utterly impossible things, jokes that made everyone laugh until their bellies ached, and thrilling adventures from mysterious lands far away. Wiener argued convincingly that this cozy campfire circle is where rich human culture was actually born. It allowed for the creation of gods, spirits, the distant past, and the exciting future. Complex things you can only comfortably think about when your stomach is completely full and you are entirely safe. And people did not simply go to sleep and stay asleep for a solid 8 hours the way we desperately try to do now. Fascinating historical records from medieval Europe and groundbreaking sleep studies from the 1990s confirm that before the invention of sleep-disrupting artificial light, humans naturally slept in two distinct phases. First, they enjoyed a deep sleep for about 4 hours, followed by a remarkably calm, wakeful period of 1 to 2 hours spent in complete, peaceful darkness, and then a cozy second sleep for another 4 hours. So, let us tally what a full, magnificent day actually looked like. About 4 to 6 hours securing food or crafting tools. About 6 glorious hours spent in rich social interaction, dramatic storytelling, mutual grooming, and playful activities. About 8 hours of peaceful sleep split into 2 separate phases, and the rest of the time spent simply lounging, watching lazy clouds, doing absolutely nothing in particular, and wonderfully existing without ever needing to justify your existence, through the toxic lens of productivity. Then, about 10,000 years ago, something drastically changed. Humans in the Fertile Crescent began planting seeds and domesticating animals. Now, agriculture, oh glorious, backbreaking agriculture, was a beautifully disguised trap. Once you foolishly start farming, you suddenly find yourself capable of feeding quite a few more hungry mouths. Naturally, more people inevitably mean you need even more food, and more food demand inexorably leads to even more grueling farming. Within just a few short, chaotic generations, populations exploded exponentially, and there was absolutely no turning back because there were now far too many demanding mouths to survive by simply hunting and gathering. You were quite thoroughly locked in. And farming, as fate would have it, required immensely more exhausting labor. There was endless plowing, tedious planting, relentless weeding, back-breaking harvesting, meticulous storing, and aggressively defending those precious crops from mischievous animals and greedy raiders. The grim skeletal evidence left behind is hilariously unambiguous. These pioneering early farmers worked significantly harder, ate remarkably worse, and died tragically younger than the carefree hunter-gatherers who merrily roamed before them. Yet, despite the misery, the stubborn population kept right on growing. And along with those bloated populations came the so-called specialists. Proud toolmakers, dusty potters, busy weavers, clever inventors, and then, inevitably, loud soldiers, solemn priests, tedious administrators, and eventually the ultimate horror. Actual jobs. Yes, employment, the bizarre, modern idea that your precious, fleeting time on Earth belongs to someone else in exchange for a handful of resources. By the time we proudly built our sprawling cities, the beautifully lazy, original human lifestyle was completely gone, utterly replaced by rigid schedules, nagging obligations, and the desperate need to work almost all of your precious waking hours just to barely survive in the very system we constructed. Today, you miserably spend roughly 90,000 hours of your life working. Your ancient ancestors spent spectacularly less. You desperately try to sleep in one solid, unnatural block and panic, calling it insomnia when you wake up at 2 in the morning. They peacefully slept in 2 distinct phases and fruitfully used those quiet middle hours for deep, leisurely reflection. You spend your entire mortal life frantically chasing a glittering illusion of greatness, piling up achievements, wealth, and success by arbitrary standards that society conveniently invented out of thin air. They, on the exact contrary, woke up every single morning already profoundly free, already entirely enough, and beautifully at peace with absolutely nothing to prove to anyone. They had absolutely no burning need to become successful. They were already effortlessly living the exact, relaxing life that you are currently working your entire stressful existence just to retire into. You might squeeze in making art if you can somehow find a sliver of time after your exhausting day job. They joyfully made art simply because they had an abundance of time. And that, fundamentally, is what humans naturally do. We are not a different biological species, but we live so radically differently from how humans comfortably lived for 99% of our earthly existence that we might as well be from another planet. In a tragic cosmic joke, we traded precious freedom for mere food security, delightful leisure for rampant population growth, and glorious, empty time for relentless productivity.